Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan, and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, ratcheting up the trade war with China, the US slaps massive tariffs on Chinese goods. Beijing launches its own anti-dumping inquiry following the measures. Once a world leader, Cuba's sugar industry is collapsing. The decline in production could impact other sectors of the island's crisis-hit economy. And a looming shortage in critical minerals needed for the energy transition. So why is global investment in the mining of those materials declining? Chinese imports help to push down the cost of products like video games, T-shirts and home appliances in the US. But many American factories say that's driven them out of business and has cost more than 1 million jobs. President Joe Biden says that he won't allow China to, quote, unfairly control the market. In a pre-election effort to protect industries and workers, he sharply raised tariffs on Chinese imports ranging from electric vehicles to solar cells. Beijing has launched its own anti-dumping investigation following the measures. So, who has the upper hand? We'll discuss it shortly with our guests, but first, a report from Imogen Kimber.
Chinese-made solar cells, lithium-ion batteries and electric vehicles are set to double, triple and quadruple in price respectively in the US, thanks to new trade tariffs by President Biden. China is not happy.
China always opposes unilateral tariff increases that violate WTO rules and will take all necessary measures to safeguard its legitimate rights and interests.
Beijing says the move damages bilateral cooperation and has hit back with an anti-dumping inquiry into plastic widely imported from the US, the EU, Taiwan and Japan, as the European Union has also launched investigations into Chinese imports. Biden says he has to protect US workers and industry from heavily subsidized Chinese exports.
If you want to do business in China, you got to have a 51% Chinese owner. You got to provide access to all your intellectual property. Sometimes they just outright steal through cyber espionage and other means. And it's been a well documented and internationally recognized. And when you make tactics like these, you're not competing. It's not competition, it's cheating.
Biden is making sure the restrictions are in place ahead of the November presidential election. It may help him in the polls with many voters who are unhappy with the US economy. Although his tariffs, said to be worth $18 billion, are expanding on tariffs worth $300 billion imposed by former President Donald Trump. Trump says the US auto industry will face a bloodbath if he loses in November, and that he will impose a 100% tariff on all cars made outside the US. Some argue since the US only imports 2% of their electric vehicles from China, the impact of this policy will be minimal and won't affect the overall economy. Beijing says the US aims to stifle China's green industry. The country is leaning towards clean energy to counter a slump in economic growth.
This is protectionism in the name of fair competition. The real aim is to contain China's new energy sectors, hamper China's high-quality development, and get advantage in the elections by competing to be tougher on China.
An unfortunate casualty may be the US's green energy targets and the two superpowers' relations, which was already fractured over military activity in the South China Sea. Even worse could be an all-out trade war between the two global giants of industry. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Well, let's take a look at some of the figures. China sold nearly $500 billion worth of goods to the US last year, but it only imported around $148 billion worth in return. The US imports just 2% of its electric vehicles from China, but the figure goes up to nearly 70% for lithium-ion batteries. Now, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, says that Chinese manufacturers received 9 times more state subsidies than their Western counterparts. Chinese businesses receive aid, which is the equivalent to 3.7% of their revenues on average, compared to only 0.4% for firms in higher income countries. We have two experts to discuss all of this with us. Joining us from Seoul in South Korea is Stephen Okun, who's the CEO of APAC Advisors, a consultancy operating at the intersection of business, government and sustainability. And from Brisbane in Australia, Warwick Powell, who's adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology and a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute, a non-government international think tank based in Beijing. Gentlemen, good to have you with us. Let's start with you then, Stephen. Why is the US so worried about Chinese goods?
Okay, they're not worried about Chinese goods per se. They're worried about Chinese goods that come into the US through unfair competition in strategic industries. And so to understand the Biden administration's actions here, and really the Trump administration's actions before that, you've got to go back a decade. You go back to what China has been doing with its Made in China 2025 policy. That came out in 2015, where China said it was going to use state subsidies and protection to foster within China key sectors for the 21st century, including electric vehicles, including renewable energy production. That policy of China's was very successful. And now China has a huge head start into these sectors. And as President Biden said, we need these sectors ourselves in the United States. So to compete on a level playing field, we have to put tariffs on those types of sectors. So it's not about banning Chinese goods. It's not about tariffing all of Chinese goods, as President Trump said he would do in a second term. It's really looking at those sectors that are strategic to the U.S. and have had unfair subsidies from China. And that's what he did.
All right, Warwick, what's your take on this? Are Chinese subsidies responsible for the decline of U.S. manufacturing and industry?
U.S. manufacturing and industry has been declining now for over 40 years. The first sounds of concerns around deindustrialization and the hollowing out of American manufacturing began in the 1970s and hasn't stopped since. The fact of the matter is that over the last 40 years, the American political economy has favored other kinds of industries, particularly in financial services, stock exchange, and those sorts of areas, instead of industrialization. And now the chickens have come home to roost. It's not like there's been a hidden agenda here. As your other guest has mentioned, China announced in 2015 a political and policy priority around domestic value adding and moving up the value chain. And of course, it's been focused on things like electric cars well before then. If people bothered reading the policy documents and the planning instruments coming out of the Chinese political system, they would have known this well in advance.
All right, Stephen, it's perhaps no coincidence that this is an election year in the US. I mean, are Biden's moves politically motivated, do you think? Is this an attempt to grab voters?
Oh, look, there's no question any move by any administration in a presidential election year is going to be looked at through that election. So that is a given. I think the Biden administration would argue in this case that this is good policy and good politics. There's no question that being tough on China is a positive in the U.S. right now. It ensures a level playing field. It ensures that the United States can have an electric vehicle industry going forward, and that if it doesn't have these types of tariffs when there is unfair competition, there isn't going to be an electric vehicle industry in the United States, and that is of national strategic importance.
What is this going to do, though, to ultimately to the U.S. economy? Is it going to help or hinder it?
Well, in terms of what will it do to the U.S. economy in the short term, it's really going to have no impact on the U.S. economy because, as we've said, there are literally zero electric vehicles being imported into the United States from China right now. These tariffs are mostly on goods. The new tariffs are mostly on goods that aren't coming in yet to ensure that the U.S. industry can have a chance to get off the ground because, you know, as the other guest has noted, the U.S. hasn't been investing in infrastructure in the United States as much as it should have been, and it's trying to do that now, and so it's going to give it a chance. The tariffs that have been extended were put into place by Donald Trump and have been in place for that $300 billion has been in place for a few years now. So it's not going to have any new inflationary impact because that has already taken place. So it's not going to really have any short-term impact on the economy, unless you're talking about extraordinarily specific sectors, maybe on certain medical devices, but that's about it.
Warwick, what does this mean for the rest of us? What happens to companies that are supplied to America partly using Chinese-produced goods?
Look, global supply chains are now incredibly complex, and many sophisticated products require inputs from production processes in a number of countries. To untangle all of that is extremely costly, with significant cost implications for downstream consumers and enterprises who rely upon stable priced supply chains to bring their intermediate goods to them. So the last few years have seen a lot of rhetoric around, de-risking and decoupling, but the basic economic and engineering reality is that it's easier said than done. Now, the competitive environment means that the world is best served, including consumers and enterprises, when they can access the least cost inputs for their activities that they need, so that they can actually proceed to do what they're good at. And I think in due course, those who pursue a rational economic policy framework, as opposed to jumping on the short-term political cycle bandwagon, will deliver real dividends for their economies and for the communities and workers that they say that they care about.
Warwick, where does the WTO fit into all of this?
Well, the WTO has been frustrated over the past 6+ years by the United States, which has frankly gone rogue in terms of the global trade regulatory framework. Since 2018, the United States has stymied the appointment of judges to the appellate dispute resolution processes of the WTO and continues to do so. This is very unhelpful for the WTO. The second point to remember about the WTO is that the United States actually has the most complaints against it out of all countries and products. With the last time I checked the WTO website, there was some 171 complaints lodged against US products. The EU had, I think from memory, about 105, 106, and China was well back in the pack with 49. So when it comes to participating in terms of fair, because we're talking about questions of fairness and participation in open trade, the US itself has clearly been a rogue player for quite some time.
Stephen, final word to you then. How do you respond to that? The US has been a rogue player for some time. It's gone rogue.
Well, look, in the 21st century, you have to take into account national security when it comes to trade and economics. And that had not been the case previously. And now when you're a country and you're looking at what is going to happen if there's a pandemic, and we have all of our sourcing from one country, and we can't get in the medical and pharmaceuticals that we need, and we can't get in terms of climate change and addressing that, the critical minerals that we need. Well, then that becomes a national security issue, and there has always been a national security exemption when it comes to the WTO. It is a different world now, and there's no question that countries are looking at trade differently. They're looking at the WTO differently. And that is what is going to make this competition and confrontation between the US and China, so fraught. And, one of the worries going forward is the United States believes it can confront China where it needs to be confronted, such as it's doing on these tariffs, but that it can also cooperate with China on, of course, the most important issue the world is facing, which is the climate crisis. Now, the question is, will China accept that framework? Will China accept the tariffs coming in, but also cooperate with the United States at the same time? So we really are on a precipice of where trade and national security are intersecting within the climate crisis that should be a concern to everybody.
Gentlemen, there I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it. Many thanks indeed. Stephen Okun and Warwick Powell. Now, the old Cuban saying goes, without sugar, there is no country. Cuba was the world's top sugar exporter for hundreds of years, and the industry was the main driver of the economy. But the island has been under US sanctions for decades, and that, in part, has affected the sugarcane harvest, which has hit its lowest level since 1900. Once unthinkable, the island now imports sugar to meet its demand. Last season, Cuba's production fell to an all-time low of 350,000 tons of raw sugar. That's well below the 1.3 million tons recorded in 2019. The slump in sugar output impacts other sectors of the Cuban economy, including its export earnings from rum. Less than 3% of state investment goes to the sugar industry. Well, the collapse of the sugar industry is just one aspect of Cuba's faltering economy. The island is suffering its worst economic crisis since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The tourism industry has dried up since the COVID-19 pandemic, depriving the island of as much as $3 billion annually. Foreign currency is in short supply, and the peso has lost nearly half its value against the dollar in 2024 alone. The government's budget gap is projected to increase to 18.5% of economic output this year. Inflation is running at more than 30%. That's more than twice the Latin America regional average. And the average salary for Cuban state workers is now less than $16 a month. Well, in response to the crisis, the Cuban government has announced tough economic measures that include raising the price of fuel by more than 500% and cutting subsidies for staples like eggs and rice, except for those deemed vulnerable. Fuel, power, medicine, milk and other food items are in short supply. In March, the government asked the UN's food program for help for the first time.
Children are supposed to get 3 kilograms of milk a month, but now they are only giving 1.5 kilograms a month.
Milk. I can't remember the last time I drank milk. It's very expensive.
Although we have difficulties, we're still alive, like we Cubans say.
Before they used to give 2.3 kilos of rice per person per month. Now they give nearly half a kilo of rice per person per month. And that's when it's available.
Joining us now from London, Emily Morris, an economist and research fellow at the University College of London's Institute of the Americas. Good to have you with us, Emily. So why has Cuba's sugar industry collapsed? Are US sanctions to blame, or is it mismanagement?
Essentially, what's happened is that previously sugar under the Soviet system was heavily subsidized. In effect, there was a kind of barter system where they got cheap fuel in return for their sugar. So now they're having to compete at world market prices, spot prices, because they don't have any contracts with anybody. It's actually not economic. I mean, the sugar industry is not economic. It's now only accounts for less than 2% of total export earnings. So, in 1990, it was over 70%. So that's the extent of the collapse of the sugar industry. So in a sense, the reduction in production for the macroeconomy isn't that important, but I think psychologically it's important. Cubans, like everybody else, think that the Cuban economy is dependent on sugar. People have a kind of historical memory. And every year the government publishes its target for the sugar production. And once again, and it happens practically every year since I've been covering Cuba for the last 30 years, the target was missed. And so that has a psychological effect. And anything that reduces export earnings is significant because of the tightness of Cuba's foreign exchange constraint.
Emily, then how can Cuba's wider economic problems be addressed? Can they be fixed?
Well, it's a very, very difficult problem because the constraints on Cuban foreign exchange earnings are extreme, not only because of the collapse of tourism but also because of the US sanctions. And they don't just prevent trade with obviously Cuba's natural trading partner, but they also prevent trade with other partners. And not only do they reduce the availability of foreign exchange, but they also result in the cancellation of contracts, of ships arriving at short notice. So there's extreme disruption as well as extreme tight foreign exchange constraint. So what happened during the COVID pandemic was essentially Cuba threw everything at it in 2020. They did incredibly well in terms of the number of people got killed and so on in 2020, but they exhausted their foreign exchange reserves. And so by 2021, they had nothing left. And so they're now scrabbling to try to meet the obligations that they've taken on. I mean, like one of your interviewees there said, there's an expectation. Cubans expect the government to give them extremely cheap rationed supplies. And so the government has a commitment to do so. But given that it's got very little foreign exchange, it's a struggle to do that all the time. And so what's the solution? The solution is to build up the foreign exchange earnings. They need to diversify the economy. That's been a necessity for a long time. In a sense, their recovery from the collapse of the Soviet system was built on just a few items. It was very concentrated in nickel, tourism, professional services. And really, they need diversification. And that seems to be what they're pushing for. But trying to diversify, to restructure the economy in the context of very, very little foreign exchange is extremely difficult.
What's life like for ordinary Cubans right now?
Well, as you saw there, life is not just food. They have very, very basic supplies of food, which is not as much as they're used to. They have to queue an awful lot. They have uncertainty. The inflation is very worrying for people on fixed incomes. Where's it going to go next? The prices in the markets are very, very high. But it's not even just that. It's not only queuing, but it's also the transport issue. There's not enough fuel. The buses are all broken down. And so everyday life is extremely difficult. They also have power cuts regularly. But having said that, sometimes it's portrayed as if everything's about to collapse. And actually, as you see from those pictures, people they haven't lost weight like they did in the 1990s. There are supplies, there is manageable, but it's very, very difficult. And now, of course, they've got a huge heat wave, which makes life even more impossible when you haven't got air conditioning and so on. So they're really suffering and really frustrated because there's so many ideas. They've opened up the private sector. So it's really possible for people to do things, but they have no finance.
Emily, really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Finally, they're needed to make wind turbines, electric vehicles and other green technologies. Minerals like copper, lithium and cobalt are in high demand as many nations try to make the transition to clean energy. But the International Energy Agency says the world faces a shortage of those minerals, with only 70% of global demand for copper and 50% for lithium expected to be met by 2035. The prices of some of the elements fell sharply last year, following 2 years of increases. The IEA says the drop in prices is discouraging investment in the mining of minerals. The Paris-based agency forecasts that investors need to put something like $800 billion into mining projects by 2040 to try to limit the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But a handful of nations and companies control their extraction. China, for example, mines most of the rare earth materials. Joining us now from London, Andy Leyland, who's the Managing Director of Supply Chain Insights. Good to have you with us, Andy. What's going on then within this industry? Why, at the moment, are miners failing to meet demand?
I mean, the huge issue that this industry has is trying to match supply with demand. And when you consider that it takes years to plan and then build the mine and get that into production, that's the supply side of the equation. Well, the demand side can change in a matter of weeks. So it's incredibly difficult to get those two matched. And the way that the market then matches them is by having price spikes or price declines, which again makes it difficult to balance the investment cycle. That's very much what we're seeing at the moment. We had a huge spike in lithium prices, supply responded, now prices have crashed. The same thing's happening in copper, where we're seeing a price spike in copper, but it will take a little while for the investment to come through and match supply and demand.
Are these minerals particularly rare or difficult to extract?
No, I mean, there's no geological shortage of any of the critical minerals that we need for the energy transition. The big barrier is in capital, it's in permitting of these operations, and in some cases in political will as well. So these are challenges that can be met. They're not insurmountable, but they do need planning, and they probably need government intervention as well. I don't think relying purely on the market and mining companies will see us able to increase the tonnages that we need for the energy transition.
And as we said, at the moment, China is mining most of these rare earth minerals. What are the dangers in that?
Since the pandemic and the sort of trend of deglobalization in the world, what we've seen is that single points of failure in the supply chain are not welcome, particularly in the West. And while the resources themselves are very geographically diverse, China has built up a huge amount of processing capacity in things like refined lithium, copper, etc. And that single point of failure just isn't seen as politically acceptable. So what we're seeing is the West trying to effectively build secondary supply chains for these materials. That obviously takes money. And where you've got established markets which are in oversupply with low margins, the commercial incentive for private industry to develop those secondary supply chains isn't necessarily there. So again, it comes back to the governments needing to get involved to provide, particularly sources to cheap debt capital to make those investments.
And Andy, what does all of this mean for consumers like you and I?
So in some respects, consumers are sheltered from the price increases. If the price of lithium doubles, it doesn't necessarily reflect in the price of your electric vehicle overnight. But the companies effectively do take on that volatility, and volatility is no one's friend when it comes to making these long-term investments. So I think for us, it creates a little bit of uncertainty. We're also facing the impact that if they don't make these investments and balance supply and demand, that it may derail some parts of the energy transition. And, when you look at climate change, the easiest way to reduce emissions is in electrification. Electrification of transport, electrification of fossil fuel burning industries, and that all needs critical minerals. It needs transmission lines, it needs copper, it needs batteries to store that energy. And, if we can't do that, then it's going to be a challenge to meet our climate goals.
Andy, it's been great to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you.
And that's our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything that you've seen, I'm at A. Finnegan on X. Please try to remember to use the hashtag AJCTC, or you could drop us a line. Countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you'll find individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team here. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.